At my wife's funeral, she left me a hidden passbook. But before I could even look inside, my daughter snatched it from my hands and tossed it straight into the garbage. "Just throw it away, Dad," she scoffed. "Mom never had any money anyway." I did not argue with her. I simply waited for her to leave the room, pulled that little blue book out of the trash, and drove straight to the bank. I expected to find a few $100s, maybe a forgotten rainy day fund. But the moment the branch manager saw the account number, the blood completely drained from his face. He locked his office door, stared at me in sheer panic, and whispered, "Please stay right here. I need to call the police. If you are just finding this story, I suggest you take a deep breath. Because what I uncovered that afternoon completely destroyed my family, but it also saved my life." Subscribe to the channel right now and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. My name is Richard. I am 70 years old. For over 4 decades, I poured every ounce of my blood, sweat, and energy into building a massive commercial real estate empire right here in Boston. I spent my life aggressively navigating boardrooms, outsmarting ruthless developers, and making sure my family never had to worry about a single financial burden. I built a fortress of wealth to protect them. But all my money and all my influence could not buy a single extra second of time when cancer came for my wife, Beatrice. We buried her this morning. It was exactly 3 hours after the funeral service. The catered reception was going on downstairs in the grand foyer of our estate. I could hear the faint murmur of 100 guests, the clinking of expensive crystal glasses, the low hum of forced sympathy. But I could not bear to be down there. I had retreated upstairs to our master bedroom, seeking the one thing I desperately needed: silence. I just wanted to be surrounded by the quiet, lingering presence of my wife. I sat on the edge of our king-sized bed, staring blankly at her antique oak vanity in the corner of the room. Beatrice was never a woman who cared about the sprawling mansions or the luxury cars I bought. While I was out securing multi-million-dollar high-rises, she happily spent her days managing a small, dusty, rare book restoration shop in the historic district. She was gentle, deeply intelligent, and fiercely independent in her own quiet way. She loved the smell of aged paper and the meticulous, slow work of repairing broken spines. She wore simple clothes, kept her graying hair tied back, and never asked me for diamonds. I slowly stood up and walked over to her vanity. Sitting perfectly centered on the polished wood was her old vintage sewing kit. It was a heavy, multi-tiered wooden box that she had owned since we were first married. I traced my fingers over the smooth lid. I unlatched the brass clasp and opened it, hoping to catch the faint scent of her lavender hand cream. The top trays were perfectly organized with spools of thread and silver needles, but as my fingers brushed against the bottom compartment, I felt something stiff hidden beneath a loose piece of dark felt. I carefully pulled the fabric back. Lying there, completely concealed from plain sight, was a small navy blue bank passbook. It was the old-fashioned paper kind that banks practically stopped issuing decades ago. The edges were heavily frayed from age, and the gold foil emblem of First Boston Bank was almost completely rubbed off the cover. I frowned, holding the worn booklet up to the light. Beatrice handled all her small business banking on the computer. She was meticulous with her digital records. Why in the world would she physically hide a paper passbook underneath her sewing supplies? I placed my thumb on the cover, just about to open it and read the ledger. But before I could turn the first page, the heavy oak door of the bedroom swung open without a single knock. My daughter Valerie marched into the room. Valerie is 42 years old, but she still moves through the world with the entitled impatience of a spoiled teenager. She was wearing a custom-tailored black Prada morning dress that cost well over $4,000. I knew the exact price because she had casually swiped my platinum credit card to pay for it just 2 days ago, claiming she needed something appropriate and respectable to honor her mother. But looking at her right now, there was no grief in her eyes. Her perfect blowout was undisturbed. Her diamond tennis bracelet caught the afternoon light as she crossed her arms. She just looked incredibly annoyed. "Dad, what are you doing hiding up here?" Valerie sighed, her tone sharp and exasperated. People are waiting for you downstairs. Derek is trying to entertain his business partners, but you need to come down and make an appearance. It looks weird. I looked down at the small blue book in my hands, trying to process her complete lack of empathy. I was just looking through your mother's sewing kit, I said softly, my voice still thick with exhaustion. I found this hidden at the bottom. Valerie stepped closer, her expensive designer heels clicking aggressively against the hardwood floor. Without asking, without a single shred of hesitation or respect, she reached out and snatched the passbook right out of my hands. She flipped it open carelessly, barely even glancing at the yellowed pages inside, and let out a harsh, mocking laugh. A passbook. From the 90s. She shook her head, looking at me like I was losing my mind. Just throw it away, Dad. Mom never had any money anyway. Her little bookshop barely broke even. You paid for everything. And then with a casual flick of her wrist, she tossed my dead wife's hidden possessions straight into the wastebasket next to the vanity. It landed with a dull thud among crumpled tissues and discarded makeup wipes. Come downstairs, Dad. Let us go, she commanded, already turning her back on me and walking out the door. I stood there frozen, staring down at the trash can. A cold, heavy knot began to form deep in the pit of my stomach. The sheer effortless cruelty of her gesture left me entirely speechless. This was Beatrice's home. She had barely been gone for a week. We had literally just put her in the ground this morning, and my own daughter was treating her mother's personal belongings like actual garbage. I looked toward the empty doorway. I thought about Valerie's perfect hair, the $4,000 dress, the impatient, condescending tone in her voice. I had spent my entire life providing for that girl, sheltering her from every storm, making absolutely sure she never knew a single day of struggle. I fully funded her elite private schools. I paid for her lavish European vacations. I handed over a massive fortune to fund her extravagant wedding to Derek. I gave her the world. But standing in that suffocatingly quiet room, listening to her casually dismiss her mother's entire life of quiet, humble work, a brutal realization washed over me. My daughter did not respect her mother. She did not respect me. She only respected my checkbook. I did not chase after her. I did not yell. 40 years in the ruthless real estate market had taught me one fundamental rule. When you spot a predator in your territory, you never raise your voice. You simply gather your leverage. I walked over to the wastebasket, reached inside, and pulled the frayed blue passbook out from the trash. I smoothed out the bent cover with my thumb. Beatrice was a very humble woman, but she was brilliantly sharp. She never kept useless trash. If she hid this, it meant something. I slipped the book into the inner pocket of my suit jacket, completely ignoring the reception happening downstairs, and walked out the back door to my car. I stepped out into the crisp Boston air. The gravel of the driveway crunched heavily beneath my shoes as I approached my car. Before I could even reach for the door handle, the heavy mahogany side door of the house swung open behind me. Dad, where are you going? It was Valerie again. Her voice carried that same grating note of irritation, entirely devoid of the sorrow that should accompany a day of mourning. Derek was right beside her, standing tall and perfectly groomed, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. I turned around slowly to face them. I felt the weight of the small blue passbook resting against my chest, hidden safely inside my tailored suit pocket. I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and for the first time in her 42 years of life, I did not see the little girl I had raised. I saw a stranger. I asked her a simple question. I asked how she could throw away her mother's personal belongings, not even 4 hours after we put her in the earth. I asked how she could look at a piece of her mother's history and treat it like garbage. Valerie let out an exasperated sigh and rolled her eyes. She opened her mouth to snap a sharp reply, but Derek smoothly intervened before she could speak. He stepped right in front of her, perfectly positioning himself as the calm, rational peacemaker. He offered a practiced, deeply sympathetic smile that he probably rehearsed in the mirror every single morning. Richard, please, Derek said, his voice dripping with honeyed concern. Valerie is just completely overwhelmed right now. We all are. She is grieving in her own way. Seeing Beatrice's old things scattered around the master bedroom was just too much for her to handle emotionally. He took a slow step closer and placed a heavy, overly familiar hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm, designed to project strength and comfort. She was only trying to declutter the room. He continued softly. She wanted to clear out the space to spare you the pain of having to sort through all those old, worthless trinkets yourself. You have been through an incredible amount of trauma today. We just want to protect your peace of mind. We want to take care of you. It was a magnificent lie. It was smooth, highly plausible, and delivered with the absolute confidence of a man who makes his living selling terrible investments to gullible clients. If I were a weaker man or a man blinded by grief, I might have actually believed him. I might have hugged him and thanked him for looking out for my fragile emotional state. But Derek made a fatal miscalculation. He assumed my sorrow had dulled my instincts. He did not stop at the lie. He immediately used it as a stepping stone for his real agenda. The fake sympathy was nothing more than the setup for a calculated sales pitch. In fact, Derek continued his tone, shifting seamlessly from sympathetic son-in-law to an eager, competent wealth manager. Valerie and I have been talking extensively about your future. You really should not be dealing with any kind of financial stress right now. The commercial properties you own, the family trust, the complex estate taxes. It is simply too much of a burden for a man who desperately needs to rest and mourn his wife. He squeezed my shoulder slightly, leaning in closer. I can take all of that heavy lifting completely off your plate, Richard. Just sign the estate management over to my firm. I already have the preliminary paperwork drafted to make the transition easy. You can just rest. Go on a long vacation. Let me handle the properties and the accounts. You have earned the right to step back. I did not pull away from his grip. I simply stood there in the chilly afternoon air and observed him. The sharp, overwhelming scent of his expensive Tom Ford cologne filled the space between us, completely masking the damp, earthy smell of the autumn leaves in my garden. I noticed the way his eyes darted anxiously searching my face for any sign of compliance. I noticed the heavy gold Rolex Daytona gleaming brightly on his wrist. It was an extravagant watch that cost more than a luxury sedan, a watch he certainly could not afford on his meager broker salary without Valerie dipping into the allowance I provided her. I had spent 40 years building massive skyscrapers from the ground up. I had spent decades sitting across from ruthless corporate rivals, crushing them in high-stakes boardroom negotiations. I knew how to read the micro-expressions of a man who was desperate to close a deal. I knew exactly what raw, unadulterated greed looked like. It was standing right in front of me wearing a perfectly tailored suit, pretending to be family. He did not care about my grief. He did not care about Beatrice. He saw my vulnerability as an open window to seize control of my life's work. The sheer audacity of his timing was breathtaking. My wife's funeral guests were literally standing 50 feet away in my living room, eating catered salmon, and my son-in-law was standing in my driveway trying to hustle me out of my empire. I forced a polite, hollow smile onto my face. I needed to maintain the illusion that I was just a tired, heartbroken old man. I could not let them know that my mind was razor-sharp and fully alert. I appreciate your deep concern for my well-being, Derek, I said, keeping my voice completely steady and devoid of any real emotion. You are very kind to think of my stress levels on a day like this. But I have a very urgent errand to run right now. I just need some time out of the house to clear my head. We will discuss the estate management and the paperwork later this week. Derek's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, his jaw tightening slightly at the rejection, but he quickly recovered. Of course, Richard, he nodded smoothly, dropping his hand from my shoulder. Take all the time you need. Drive safely. We will be right here waiting for you. I turned my back on them and opened the heavy door of my Bentley. As I slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, I glanced at them through the rearview mirror. They were standing side by side in the driveway, watching my car intensely. They looked less like a concerned daughter and son-in-law, and more like two starving vultures patiently waiting for a wounded animal to finally stop breathing. I shifted the car into gear and slowly pulled out of the gated driveway, leaving my massive estate behind. I merged onto the busy main road heading straight toward the downtown financial district. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel tightly. I reached into my pocket and touched the frayed edge of the blue passbook again. Derek's lies had confirmed every dark suspicion. I was going to find the truth. The crisp autumn wind bit at my face the moment I stepped onto the cobblestone pathway. The heavy bass of the jazz band playing in the main hall faded behind the thick brick walls. I pulled my coat tighter around my shoulders, feeling the solid shape of the small passbook pressing against my chest. My mind was churning through the bizarre interaction upstairs. The gravel crunched under my shoes as I approached my slate-gray Bentley Continental. I unlocked the door, slid into the leather seat, and pressed the ignition. The engine roared to life. For the first time all day, I was completely alone. The suffocating weight of the morning guests and the presence of my daughter and her husband were finally sealed outside the glass windows of my vehicle. I navigated the winding driveway and merged onto the damp streets of Boston. A light drizzle had begun to fall, smearing the windshield before the wipers swept it away. The rhythmic sound of the blades became a metronome for my thoughts. I drove past the sprawling mansions of my neighborhood, my mind locked entirely on Derek. I replayed his exact words and posture. I have spent 40 years navigating the cutthroat world of commercial real estate. You do not survive in that arena without learning how to read people. You learn to spot desperation hidden behind a confident smile. You learn to see the exact moment a person reveals their true motive. Derek had revealed his motive perfectly. His urgency was not born out of grief. It was raw, unchecked ambition. He wanted control of my estate immediately. Why try to force a grieving widower to sign away his financial autonomy before his wife was even cold in the ground? It made absolutely no logical sense unless there was a specific pressing reason he needed access to my capital right now. He had smelled blood in the water, assuming my sorrow had turned me into a weak, compliant old man. He thought I would blindly sign anything to make the headache go away. He severely underestimated me. I am the architect of a massive empire, and I protect what is mine. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, the tires hissing against the wet asphalt. I reached into my jacket and pulled the blue passbook out, resting it on the center console. I glanced at it briefly. The frayed edges, the faded gold lettering of First Boston Bank. It looked like an obsolete relic from a bygone era, something entirely worthless. Valerie had certainly thought so. But Valerie only understood designer labels and immediate gratification. She saw a dusty old book and assumed it was garbage. But I knew Beatrice. I knew the quiet, brilliant mind that operated behind her gentle smile. She ran her book restoration shop with absolute precision, tracking every single expense with flawless accuracy. She did not keep clutter, and she most certainly did not construct a false bottom in a heavy wooden sewing kit just to hide a piece of trash. If Beatrice went to the trouble of hiding this passbook so carefully, it meant something incredibly important. I stared at the road ahead, watching the skyline of downtown Boston emerge through the mist. I had always assumed I knew everything about our finances. I managed the commercial accounts, the real estate portfolios, and the family trusts. Beatrice lived comfortably on the modest profits from her bookshop and the allowance I provided. She always told me she did not need much to be happy. But looking at that passbook, a strange gut feeling began to gnaw at me. There was a hidden chapter of my wife's life that I knew absolutely nothing about. I was about to open a door she had kept locked for decades. The traffic thickened as I entered the financial district. The towering glass and steel structures loomed over the narrow historic streets, casting long shadows, despite the early afternoon hour. I navigated the Bentley through the familiar grid, turning onto the street, where the main branch of First Boston Bank was located. I pulled into the private client parking garage beneath the imposing stone building, flashed my premium account card to the attendant, and parked in a reserved spot near the elevator bank. I sat in the quiet cabin holding the passbook. A wave of profound sadness washed over me. I missed her quiet wisdom, the way she could ground me after a chaotic day of brutal negotiations. I took a deep, steadying breath, pushing the grief down into a locked compartment in my mind. Right now, I needed the cold, analytical real estate developer to take the wheel. I needed to uncover exactly what my wife had left behind, and I needed to understand why Derek was circling my estate like a starving predator. I stepped out of the car and walked to the private elevator. I pressed the button for the main lobby. The doors opened, and I stepped out onto the pristine, echoing marble floors of the bank. Bank tellers in crisp suits worked quietly behind thick glass partitions. I bypassed the standard teller lines entirely and walked directly toward the polished mahogany doors of the private wealth management section. A young receptionist looked up from her desk as I approached. "Good afternoon, Mr. Montgomery," she said smoothly. "I am so terribly sorry for your loss. Please let us know if there is anything we can do for you." "Thank you," I replied, my voice deliberately flat and commanding. "I need to see Victor Thorne immediately." The receptionist blinked, momentarily thrown off balance. "Mr. Thorne is currently in a conference call, sir. If you would like to take a seat, I can let him know you are here." I placed my hands firmly on the edge of her desk, projecting the quiet intimidation I reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. "You will interrupt his call," I said slowly. "You will tell Victor that Richard Montgomery is standing in the lobby, and I expect him to open his door right this second. It is an urgent matter." She swallowed hard. "Of course, Mr. Montgomery. Right away." She dialed a short extension, speaking in hushed tones. Less than 30 seconds later, the heavy oak door to the branch manager's office swung open. Victor Thorne emerged, looking slightly flustered, but wearing a welcoming smile. He knew exactly how much capital I kept in this institution. "Richard." "Please come in," Victor said, extending his hand. "My deepest condolences. I was not expecting to see you today." I ignored his hand and walked straight into his soundproof office. I waited for Victor to close the heavy door behind us. The moment the latch clicked shut, cutting off the ambient noise of the lobby, I reached into my jacket pocket. I pulled out the frayed vintage passbook and placed it dead center on his polished desk. I simply looked at him. "My wife hid this deep inside her bedroom," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I absolutely need to know exactly what is inside this forgotten account today. Do not ever lie to me. I need to know the entire truth right now." Victor Thorne sat frozen in his high-backed leather chair. For a man who managed the wealth of Boston's elite, he was usually a picture of perfectly practiced corporate composure. He possessed that polished and impenetrable banking exterior designed specifically to project absolute security to his wealthy and demanding clients. But as his eyes locked onto the frayed blue cover of the passbook, currently resting on his massive mahogany desk, that entire professional facade completely evaporated into the thin air. All the warm color instantly drained from his terrified face, leaving him with an intensely ashen and noticeably sickly pallor. His mouth opened slightly, but absolutely no words came out. He stared at the faded gold lettering on the booklet, as if I had just placed a live explosive device directly in the center of his perfectly organized workspace environment. The silence in the grand room became thick and suffocating. I watched his hands closely and saw they were trembling. A man who managed billions of dollars every single day was visibly shaking over a battered and worn little booklet that my own daughter had casually tossed into the garbage just a few agonizingly long and incredibly painful hours prior. "Mr. Montgomery," Victor finally whispered, his voice cracking in fear. I have never heard him speak in such a manner. "Where exactly did you find this highly unusual financial document?" "I found it hidden inside my late wife's personal bedroom," I replied slowly, my tone remaining dangerously level and calm. "And I am waiting for you to tell me immediately why you are looking at it with such absolute terror." Victor did not answer my direct question with an explanation. Instead, he abruptly pushed his heavy chair back and stood. His movements were completely erratic and devoid of usual grace. He practically scrambled around the sharp edge of his desk, walked rapidly over to the heavy oak door of the executive office, and quickly engaged the solid metal privacy deadbolt. The loud metallic click echoed sharply across the quiet room. He then walked over to the tall exterior glass windows facing the main bank floor and pulled the blinds shut, plunging his entire office into a muted and dim light. He returned to his desk, heavily leaning his entire weight against the polished wood, while breathing in a ragged rhythm. He looked at me with a mixture of profound dread. "Richard, if I need you to stay right here," Victor said. He swallowed hard, abandoning the formal pleasantries we usually maintained. "I have to make an urgent and highly confidential phone call right now. I need to call the local authorities. We need the police inside this building immediately without delay." I remained perfectly still, seated comfortably in the guest chair. My physical posture was relaxed, but my mind was calculating 1,000 different terrible scenarios within a single fleeting second. I had come here expecting to find a forgotten fund, maybe a few $1,000s Beatrice had quietly set aside. The sudden involvement of law enforcement fundamentally changed the equation. "Sit down, Victor," I commanded him with cold, absolute authority. I injected decades of ruthless boardroom dominance into my voice. "I am not a man who waits blindly while others call the police into my highly private and personal affairs. You are going to sit back down in that chair, and you are going to explain exactly what is happening. You are not picking up that telephone receiver until I fully understand what kind of situation I am looking at." Victor hesitated, his hand hovering over the black telephone receiver. He looked at my face, recognized the immovable resolve there, and slowly sank back down into his expensive leather chair. He took a deep breath, running a visibly trembling hand through his perfectly styled and usually immaculate dark brown hair. "Richard," he began, his tone dropping to a harsh whisper, "that passbook is not just a standard retail savings ledger. It is a physical bearer instrument for a highly restricted, heavily encrypted, and immensely powerful private corporate trust fund account. It is an archaic security measure obsolete in modern banking, but incredibly secure because it explicitly requires actual physical possession to authorize any primary structural changes to the trust framework." I frowned deeply, looking down at the worn blue cover. Beatrice ran a small and quiet book restoration shop, Victor. She handled dusty old manuscripts and repaired fragile antique bindings. She did not operate encrypted and highly restricted financial trusts. "You are making a terrible mistake regarding my wife's accounts." Victor shook his head slowly, a strange look flashing briefly through his panicked eyes, an expression resembling profound professional reverence. "With all due respect, Richard, there was an entire side to your wonderful wife that you knew absolutely nothing about. Beatrice was not just restoring damaged books in her shop. Back in the late 90s, when the internet tech boom was just beginning to take shape across the financial markets, she quietly took the modest profits from her little business and started making highly aggressive and brilliant private technology investments. She had a genius mind for evaluating early-stage technology. She saw the massive potential in digital infrastructure long before the traditional stock market ever managed to finally catch up. She funneled her quiet earnings into obscure early software companies, and she completely dominated the digital communications platform investment sector. I sat there in the dim room, absorbing his words, feeling a profound sense of utter shock rippling through me. My beautiful, quiet Beatrice had been a secret financial mastermind. The woman who wore simple cardigans and smelled of lavender. The woman who let me handle the commercial real estate because she claimed she had absolutely no head for finance. She had been playing the venture capital game perfectly silently, and she had been winning it right under my nose. She successfully maintained a brilliant independence while letting me believe that I was the sole powerful provider for our family. It was not a betrayal, but a testament to genius. How much I asked, keeping my voice incredibly calm internally. How much wealth did she manage to quietly build up? Victor pulled his computer keyboard closer and typed frantically quickly, bypassing several heavy security prompts to access the hidden records. He turned the monitor slightly so I could see clearly. through aggressive compounding and highly strategic reinvestments over the years. The trust connected to that specific passbook currently holds exactly $28 million in extremely diversified liquid financial assets. $28 million. The number hung heavily between us. My mind flashed back to my daughter in my bedroom, sneering with absolute disdain as she tossed it away carelessly. She threw away a massive fortune because of her arrogance. I felt a fierce, intense surge of pride for Beatrice, but that pride was instantly eclipsed by the harsh reality. Victor was not looking at the balance with professional satisfaction. He was still sweating profusely, and his eyes darted frantically. "If my wife built this," I asked, leaning forward slowly, "why are you locking your door and calling the police?" "Because Richard," Victor whispered in terror. "The money is moving." Victor reached out with a violently trembling hand and grabbed the heavy metallic base of his computer monitor. He slowly swiveled the large screen around so that it directly faced my side of the polished mahogany desk. The bright blue and white glare of the banking interface illuminated the dark space between us. I leaned forward, narrowing my eyes to read the complex financial data flashing across the screen. My entire life had been spent analyzing spreadsheets, reading profit and loss margins, and dismantling financial structures. But the screen in front of me was not showing a commercial real estate transaction. It was showing a massive, unauthorized hemorrhage of my family's hidden wealth. "Look right there at the top row," Victor instructed, his voice barely rising above a panicked whisper. He pointed a shaking index finger at a specific string of bold red numbers. "That is a priority international wire transfer request. It was initiated exactly 3 hours ago." I stared directly at the digital timestamp logged right next to the transaction. 10:15 in the morning. My mind instantly snapped back to exactly where I had been at 10:15 this morning. I had been standing at the wooden podium in the center aisle of St. Jude Cathedral. I had been delivering the final eulogy for my wife of over 40 years. My voice had been breaking as I recounted her gentle nature, her quiet wisdom, and her absolute devotion to our family. And right at that exact same moment, while the entire congregation bowed their heads in solemn respect, someone was actively routing $28 million out of her private trust account. "Where exactly is this massive amount of money going?" I asked, feeling a cold, mechanical detachment wash over my initial shock. "It is being routed through a highly complex web of intermediary banking institutions," Victor explained quickly, clicking his mouse to open a secondary window on the screen. "It was designed specifically to bypass our standard retail security flags. The final destination is a corporate shell account registered in the Cayman Islands under the name Horizon Global Holdings. It is a completely untraceable offshore entity. Once the funds successfully clear international waters and hit that specific account, they will be instantly dispersed across dozens of anonymous sub-accounts. The money will effectively vanish into thin air." I leaned back in my leather chair, keeping my breathing incredibly slow and measured. A transaction of this incredible magnitude requires absolute and verifiable authorization, Victor. It requires verified signatures, intense security clearances, and multi-step verification protocols. Beatrice is dead. I certainly did not authorize this massive withdrawal. How did this request even enter your secure system? Victor opened another digital file and pulled up a set of scanned legal documents. He turned the screen further toward my direction. "The request came through our highly secure digital client portal," he said, wiping a heavy bead of sweat from his pale forehead. "It was accompanied by this comprehensive set of legal directives. They are fully notarized power of attorney documents. They grant complete and total control of the private trust to a designated secondary manager in the event of your wife's passing." I stared at the high-resolution scans on the bright monitor. At the very bottom of the final page, starkly visible against the white background, were 2 signatures. One belonged to Beatrice. The other belonged to me. They were absolutely perfect forgeries. Whoever had executed this fraudulent document had studied our personal handwriting meticulously. The loops, the pressure points, the subtle slant of the cursive letters, it was all replicated with terrifying precision. But I knew for an absolute fact that neither Beatrice nor I had ever signed a single piece of paper granting anyone external control over her private assets. These signatures are completely fraudulent, I stated calmly. This entire document is a complete fabrication. Who exactly submitted it? Victor clicked on a final tab, bringing up the digital security log for the transaction. The documents were uploaded and electronically verified using a secure two-factor authentication process. He explained, his voice trembling again. The confirmation request was routed directly to the primary emergency contact email address listed on the trust file. The email address belongs to your daughter, Valerie. The name hit the quiet room like a physical blow. Valerie. My daughter. The same woman who had stood beside me at the cemetery, dabbing her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief. The same woman who had just stormed into my master bedroom, snatched this very passbook out of my hands and callously tossed it into the garbage. Suddenly, the entire twisted puzzle snapped together with blinding clarity. Valerie and Derek had not thrown the passbook away because they thought it was worthless trash. They threw it away because they firmly believed it was already entirely empty. They had initiated the massive offshore transfer during the funeral service, calculating that my profound grief would keep me entirely distracted and completely away from any financial matters. They desperately needed the physical passbook to be discarded and permanently forgotten before I could ever think to investigate its actual contents. Their aggressive push to declutter the master bedroom, Derek's smooth insistence that I immediately sign over the estate management to his firm, it was all a meticulously coordinated smokescreen. They were actively trying to blindfold me while they robbed my dead wife blind. The elaborate mourning, the expensive black designer dress, the tearful embraces at the cathedral. It was nothing but a theatrical performance to cover up a staggering heist. My own flesh and blood had turned my beloved wife's funeral into a scheduled bank robbery. I felt a profound, chilling rage settle deep into my bones. It was a cold, calculating fury that entirely eclipsed my grief. For decades, I had ruthlessly crushed business rivals who had tried to steal from me in the corporate arena. Now the absolute worst kind of thieves were sitting in my own kitchen, drinking expensive champagne that I had paid for toasting to a fortune they had just stolen from a dead woman. Richard, Victor stammered, pulling me back to the stark reality of the banking office. The protocol for a fraudulent transfer of this massive size is absolute. I have to alert the federal authorities immediately. The local police alone cannot handle offshore wire fraud of $28 million. This falls directly under the strict jurisdiction of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have to report this right now before the transfer fully clears the clearinghouse batch cycle this afternoon. Has the money actually left the bank yet? I asked, my voice slicing through his panic with sharp precision. No, Victor replied to my question nervously. International transfers of this sheer size are subject to an automatic internal holding period. The funds are currently frozen in a pending state within our central outgoing ledger. They will not physically move to the Cayman Islands until our compliance department completes a final manual review at the end of the business day. But the system shows the request as fully authorized by your daughter. I must call the federal agents right now. Make the call, Victor, I said softly. Do it quietly. Do not trigger any alarms that might alert the account holders. Victor nodded, his hands shaking, as he picked up the receiver and dialed a direct unlisted number for federal financial crimes. He spoke in hushed, hurried tones, reciting specialized banking codes that conveyed the absolute severity of the situation. The wait that followed was agonizingly silent. We sat in his dim, locked office, the glowing monitor casting a pale blue light across our faces. 20 minutes later, there was a sharp, distinct knock at the private side entrance of the bank. Victor practically ran to unlock it. Two men in sharp, inconspicuous charcoal suits stepped into the room. The lead agent introduced himself as Special Agent Harris. He did not look like the federal agents you see in Hollywood movies. He was impeccably dressed, carrying a leather briefcase looking exactly like a high-level corporate auditor. This discreet approach was standard protocol for financial crimes involving hundreds of millions of dollars, designed to prevent market panic or public scandals before all the facts were verified. Harris closed the door and immediately took control of the room, his eyes scanning the forged documents and the pending wire transfer on the screen. Mr. Montgomery Harris said, his voice completely devoid of emotion, as he carefully inspected the passbook. I am incredibly sorry for the loss of your wife. However, what we are looking at here is a massive, highly coordinated federal crime. Wire fraud, exceeding $10 million, instantly triggers an automatic and mandatory federal jurisdiction protocol. Your son-in-law and your daughter have utilized a highly sophisticated digital forgery method to bypass primary banking security measures. If this money had successfully crossed international waters into that Cayman Islands shell account, it would have been instantly fractured into dozens of untraceable micro-accounts. You would have never seen a single dime of this fortune ever again. They knew exactly what they were doing, and they executed it with terrifying precision. Harris paused, pulling out a secure digital tablet to initiate his formal report. The standard operating procedure for a crime of this staggering magnitude is immediate tactical intervention. We have the digital footprint, the IP address, and the forged authorization forms. I am going to dispatch a federal cybercrimes unit to your estate right this second. We will raid the property, seize all electronic devices, confiscate their mobile phones, and place Derek and Valerie under immediate federal arrest before they have any opportunity to realize the transfer has been flagged and attempt to flee the country entirely. I listened to the agent outline his tactical plan. It was efficient. It was swift. It was exactly the kind of overwhelming force the government uses to crush financial criminals. But as I sat there looking at the glowing red numbers on the banking monitor, a deep, cold certainty settled over my mind. A raid would certainly stop the theft, but it would not give me the complete truth. It would only scratch the surface of their betrayal. Agent Harris. I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room, with the heavy, undeniable authority of a man who has spent 4 decades dictating terms to ruthless billionaires. You are not going to raid my house today. You are not going to arrest my daughter or my son-in-law this afternoon. Harris stopped typing on his tablet, a look of profound confusion washing over his disciplined face. Sir, with all due respect, they are actively attempting to steal $28 million. If we do not move immediately, we risk losing the evidentiary trail. We must secure the physical devices they use to initiate this fraudulent request. I stood up from my chair, buttoning my suit jacket with deliberate, measured movements. I looked directly into the federal agent's eyes, projecting an aura of absolute, unbreakable dominance. If you arrest them right now, I explained slowly, you will only catch them for this specific digital transaction. You will give them the opportunity to hire expensive defense attorneys, to claim it was a terrible misunderstanding, to play the role of grieving, confused family members who made a desperate mistake under profound emotional distress. I will not allow them to hide behind their grief. I do not just want to stop the wire transfer. I want to know exactly why Derek is so unbelievably desperate for this massive amount of capital right now. I want to know who else is involved in this elaborate scheme. And most importantly, I want to see exactly how deep this vile rot goes inside my own family. Harris crossed his arms, evaluating my posture. You are talking about running a covert intelligence operation inside your own home, Mr. Montgomery. That is incredibly dangerous. They are operating under the assumption that they have successfully stolen a fortune. When people truly believe they have that kind of money, they become highly unpredictable. That is exactly why we must let them continue to believe they have won. I countered smoothly, my strategic developer mindset fully taking over the situation. I turned to Victor, who was trembling by his desk. Victor, you are going to leave that wire transfer exactly as it is right now. Keep it listed as pending in the digital portal. Do not flag it. Do not cancel it. Do not do a thing that would trigger an automated alert to Valerie's email address. Let them refresh their screens and see the money moving through the clearing process. Let them drink their champagne and celebrate their victory. Harris looked at me, professional respect replacing his skepticism. You are asking to act as a federal informant against your family. We would need you to gather supplementary evidence. We need you to monitor their behavior and feed us intelligence without breaking your cover. Can you maintain that facade? Can you look your daughter in the eyes knowing what she did? I thought about Valerie snatching the passbook from my hands. I thought about the contempt in her voice as she threw Beatrice's legacy away. My grief had evaporated, replaced by a cold resolve. I can do whatever is necessary to protect my wife's honor, I stated. Harris nodded, recognizing I was not a victim, but a predator ready to hunt. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out federal cooperation agreements. We will secure the funds on our back end, Harris said. The money will never actually leave American soil, but on their end, the illusion will remain intact. You have exactly 48 hours to gather internal intelligence before we are legally mandated to execute the arrest warrants. I signed the documents with a steady hand. I did not feel fear. I felt absolute clarity. I thanked Victor and shook hands with the agents. I walked out of the bank, leaving the panic behind. As I unlocked my Bentley, I was no longer a heartbroken father returning to mourn. I was a man preparing to burn his kingdom to the ground to ensure the traitors burned with it. The drive back to the estate felt entirely different than my earlier journey into the city. The rain had intensified, drumming a relentless beat against the roof of the Bentley, mirroring the calculated rhythm of my racing thoughts. I navigated the familiar winding roads with a cold, mechanical precision. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel, perfectly steady with the weight of absolute resolve. The massive wrought iron gates of my property loomed ahead in the gray afternoon mist. They parted silently, welcoming the master of the house back into his domain. I parked on the circular gravel driveway, turned off the ignition, and sat in the profound silence of the cabin. I was about to walk into a den of thieves. I smoothed the lapels of my tailored morning suit, took a deep breath of the damp autumn air, and walked toward the heavy mahogany front door. The chaotic energy of the post-funeral gathering had completely dissipated. The caterers had quietly cleared away the silver trays, leaving the grand foyer and the formal living rooms feeling hollow. But beneath the lingering scent of white lilies, there was another sound echoing through the empty corridors of my home. It was the distinct, unmistakable sound of genuine amusement. Light, bubbly laughter drifted down the hallway from the direction of the gourmet kitchen. It was not the polite chuckle of mourning guests sharing fond memories. It was the bright, uninhibited laughter of people who had just received the greatest news of their lives. I walked silently across the thick Persian rugs, allowing me to approach the kitchen archway, completely undetected. I paused just out of sight, standing in the shadows of the formal dining room, and observed the sickening tableau unfolding within my own home. Valerie and Derek were standing by the expansive marble island in the center of the kitchen. The gloomy, subdued demeanor they had so carefully projected at the cemetery was completely gone. Valerie was leaning against the polished stone counter, her expensive black designer dress now looking like chic cocktailware. She had kicked off her heels and was holding a delicate crystal flute, her face flushed with excitement and pure, unadulterated greed. Derek stood right beside her, his suit jacket discarded, his tie loosened casually. In his hand he held a bottle of vintage Louis Roederer champagne. I knew exactly what that bottle was because I had purchased it myself for $5,000 at a private auction in Paris. Derek poured the golden, effervescent liquid into Valerie's glass, grinning with the smug, arrogant satisfaction of a man who firmly believed he had just successfully outsmarted the world. They clinked their crystal flutes together in a celebratory toast, completely oblivious to the fact that the true master of the estate was standing just 15 feet away in the shadows. I stepped out of the darkness and walked into the bright recessed lighting of the kitchen. The sharp clatter of my hard leather shoes against the imported Italian tile instantly shattered their private celebration. Valerie gasped loudly, nearly dropping her crystal flute as she spun around to face me. Derek froze mid-sip, his eyes widening in sudden absolute panic. The transformation was instantaneous and thoroughly nauseating. In the fraction of a second it took them to register my presence, they completely discarded their celebratory joy and violently shoved themselves back into the roles of the grieving, deeply concerned family members. Valerie immediately slumped her shoulders, arranging her facial features into a mask of profound sorrow. Derek quickly placed the $5,000 bottle of champagne onto the marble counter behind him. He rapidly smoothed his wrinkled shirt and stepped forward with his arms slightly outstretched, projecting an aura of gentle, highly protective sympathy. It was a flawless theatrical performance executed with the practiced ease of seasoned con artists. "Richard, thank God you are home," Derek said, his voice instantly dropping an entire octave into a register dripping with honeyed fake concern. "We were starting to get terribly worried about you being out on the slick roads in your fragile state of mind." Valerie rushed forward, placing a gentle, overly dramatic hand on my forearm. "Daddy, you look completely exhausted," she cooed, treating me with the delicate, patronizing caution one might use when handling a confused, helpless toddler. "You should not have driven yourself into the city today. It is entirely too much stress for your heart. Come sit down at the island. Let me brew you a cup of hot tea to soothe your nerves. You simply must rest. You need us to take care of you right now." I looked down at her manicured hand resting on my sleeve. A profound wave of pure revulsion washed over me. I wanted to scream that I knew exactly what they had done. But I remembered Agent Harris. I remembered the federal trap. I forced my muscles to remain completely relaxed, projecting the illusion of a tired, broken old man. "I am fine, Valerie," I replied, my voice raspy and deliberately weak. I simply needed to get out of the house. I walked past her, deliberately ignoring the offer of the herbal tea, and moved straight toward the custom mahogany liquor cabinet built into the far wall. I reached for a heavy crystal tumbler and unstoppered a decanter containing my oldest, most expensive Kentucky bourbon. I poured a generous measure of the amber liquid, the familiar clinking sound grounding my turbulent emotions. I took a slow, deliberate sip, letting the fiery heat burn down my throat, effectively masking the absolute disgust I felt toward the two predators standing directly behind me. I turned back to face them, leaning heavily against the counter to sell the physical illusion of my profound emotional fatigue. I noticed the bottle of champagne still sitting on the island. You two seemed to be finding a way to cope with the sorrow I observed, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and innocent as I gestured. Derek stepped in immediately, smoothly running interference. "Oh, this," he chuckled nervously, a terrible, unconvincing sound that echoed awkwardly. "We just needed something to momentarily take the incredibly sharp edge off the profound grief, Richard. It has been a brutally devastating day. But truthfully, I also received some incredibly positive professional news this afternoon, and we were just taking a brief moment to count our blessings." He puffed his chest out slightly, completely unable to contain his massive swelling hubris. In fact, he continued his tone, shifting into the confident, boasting cadence of an arrogant wealth manager. "I actually just closed a massive offshore deal. It is probably the biggest international transaction my firm has ever facilitated. It completely secures our financial future." I took another slow sip of my bourbon, hiding my grim, silent smile behind the rim of the crystal tumbler. The staggering audacity of his statement was breathtaking. They were already mentally spending the money planning their luxurious future, completely convinced their offshore Cayman Islands shell account was absolutely overflowing with untraceable millions. The internal conflict raging inside me was suffocatingly tense, but the true power lay entirely in my absolute silence, waiting to destroy them completely. I placed the heavy, ornate crystal tumbler down on the cold marble counter with a soft, deliberate thud. The sound was swallowed by the ambient hum of the luxury refrigerator and the continued oblivious chatter of my daughter and her husband. I offered them a final hollow nod, the kind of dismissive gesture one gives to strangers and slowly turned my back on their private celebration. I walked out of the kitchen, leaving them to their stolen victory and their $5,000 champagne. The long walk down the shadowed hallway toward the east wing of the estate felt like a march across a battlefield. Every single step carried me further away from the grieving widower I had been this morning and closer to the ruthless architect of their impending ruin. I reached the heavy reinforced oak door of my private home office. It was a room designed for absolute security, fortified with soundproofing materials and digital encryption measures. I stepped inside, pressed my thumb against the biometric lock, and heard the heavy steel deadbolt slide into place with a satisfying, absolute finality. The private room was entirely dark. I walked over to my massive leather chair and sank into it, letting the absolute silence wrap around me like a heavy cloak. I stared blankly at the dark wood of my desk, my mind swirling with the incredibly toxic image of Valerie raising her crystal flute in a celebratory toast to her mother's hidden fortune. How had the little girl who used to sit on my lap turned into a callous, unfeeling vulture, willing to rob her own mother on the day of her funeral? The answer was a bitter, jagged pill that I had to swallow in the solitude of that dark room. I had created her. Beatrice had offered quiet wisdom, but I had offered endless, unlimited resources. I had bought her affection with luxury cars, designer wardrobes, and an endless stream of unearned allowances. I had systematically shielded her from every single consequence and every character-building hardship the world had to offer. I had not raised a daughter. I had financed a monster. That profound realization did not bring me to tears. It brought me to a state of chilling, absolute clarity. I had built the spoiled, entitled creature currently drinking champagne in my kitchen, which meant I was the only person equipped to completely dismantle her. I reached across the desk and picked up my secure, encrypted mobile phone. I scrolled down to a number I had not dialed in nearly a decade. It belonged to Mike Gallagher. Mike was a former federal intelligence operative who now operated as a top-tier private investigator for the corporate elite. The line rang exactly twice before a gravelly professional voice answered the call. Richard Mike said, his tone perfectly neutral. "I heard about Beatrice. I am truly sorry for your loss." "Save the condolences, Mike," I replied, my voice completely stripped of any warmth. "I need you to initiate a comprehensive, full-scale investigation tonight. I am authorizing unlimited resources and granting unrestricted access to my operational capital. I want you to look into my son-in-law, Derek, and I want you to look into my daughter, Valerie." Mike did not ask unnecessary questions. "What exactly are we looking for?" "I want you to tear their entire existence apart," I instructed him, feeling the cold, predatory rhythm of my heart matching the precision of my words. "I want every bank statement, every hidden credit card, every text message, and every deleted email. I want to know exactly how much debt Derek is currently hiding. I want to know about his offshore contacts, his shell companies, and any illicit deals he has been orchestrating behind closed doors. They are currently attempting to launder a massive sum of money through the Cayman Islands. Leave absolutely no stone unturned. If Derek has a mistress, I want her name. I want to know everything they are hiding before the sun comes up tomorrow." "Consider it done," Mike replied smoothly. "You will have a preliminary dossier by 6 in the morning." He severed the connection without another word. The hounds had been unleashed. But gathering intelligence was only the first phase of the operation. I needed to ensure that their impending financial ruin was absolute and entirely irreversible. I picked up the phone again and dialed the direct emergency line for my primary estate attorney, Eleanor Vance. Eleanor handled the intricate architecture of my $50 million Maine family trust. "Richard," Eleanor answered, her voice laced with genuine concern. "It is nearly midnight. Is there an emergency with the estate, Eleanor?" "I need you to open my primary trust file right now," I commanded. "I need you to initiate an immediate, irrevocable alteration to the beneficiary structure. You are going to completely excise Valerie from the entire $50 million trust." "Richard," she cautioned gently, "you are grieving. Making massive, sweeping changes to a generational trust on the night of your wife's funeral is highly irregular. I strongly advise you to wait. My head has never been clearer, Eleanor. I stated, my voice echoing with deadly conviction. Valerie and her husband have actively attempted to defraud this family today. I am legally severing her from my wealth. You will remove her name from the primary properties, the stock portfolios, and the liquid asset reserves. I want her permanently legally cut off from every single dime I have ever earned. There was a long, heavy silence. She knew I was not speaking out of temporary, irrational grief. I was executing a calculated, strategic amputation. I understand, Richard. Eleanor finally replied, the soft clicking of her keyboard echoing through the line. I will bypass the standard review periods and apply the emergency execution protocols. The primary trust will be completely restructured and legally binding by the time you wake up tomorrow morning. Valerie will effectively be a financial ghost within this family. Make absolutely sure the changes are silent, I instructed her, tracing the dark wood grain of my desk. Do not send any automated notifications to her accounts. I want her to continue believing she is the sole heir to an empire until the exact moment I decide to pull the ground entirely out from beneath her feet. It will be completely invisible, Eleanor confirmed. You have my word. I slowly terminated the call. I sat back in the heavy leather chair, entirely surrounded by the impenetrable silence of the fortified room. The federal trap had been meticulously set. The federal authorities were silently watching their every digital move. A private intelligence operative was currently ripping through the darkest corners of their personal lives. And the massive inheritance they had banked their entire arrogant future upon had just evaporated into nothingness with a few strokes of a keyboard. They were drinking expensive champagne in my kitchen, toasting to their brilliance, completely unaware that they were already financially dead. I closed my eyes and let the profound, absolute silence wash over me patiently, preparing for the brutal war that would begin precisely at dawn. I was ready to absolutely destroy everything they loved. The morning sun pierced through the heavy velvet curtains of my study, signaling the beginning of the 48-hour countdown. I had not slept a single moment. My mind had spent the entire night constructing a flawless mental fortress. I stood up from my leather chair, stretched my stiff limbs, and walked over to the antique mirror hanging near the doorway. I needed to carefully arrange my physical appearance. I let my shoulders slump forward deliberately, ruining my usually immaculate posture. I allowed my facial muscles to relax into a mask of hollow, overwhelming fatigue. I practiced a vacant, lost stare, the exact look of a broken old man who had completely lost his compass. When I was entirely satisfied with the pathetic reflection staring back at me, I unlocked the heavy oak door and stepped out into the quiet hallway. The fragrant aroma of freshly brewed coffee guided me toward the sunlit kitchen. Valerie and Derek were already seated at the massive marble island. They looked incredibly well rested, their faces glowing with the vibrant energy of sudden unearned wealth. Derek was dressed in a sharp, casual morning suit, tapping frantically on his sleek digital tablet. Valerie was holding a steaming ceramic mug, her posture relaxed and confident. The moment she heard my slow, shuffling footsteps echoing on the hard tile floor, her entire demeanor shifted with terrifying speed. She instantly dropped her shoulders, morphed her bright expression into a portrait of deep, tragic concern, and rushed across the kitchen to guide me toward a padded barstool. "Daddy? You look absolutely terrible," Valerie whispered, her voice dripping with artificial, sickly, sweet sympathy. "You should still be in bed. We were just about to bring a breakfast tray up to your room. You need to gather your strength." I sank heavily into the chair, letting out a long, ragged sigh that sounded entirely genuine. "I just could not sleep," I murmured, keeping my voice incredibly frail and distant. "The house feels so incredibly empty without your mother. Everywhere I look, I expect to see her standing there." Derek immediately closed his tablet, sliding it slightly across the smooth marble surface, and leaned forward with a practiced look of solemn solidarity. We know how incredibly difficult this transition is going to be for you, Richard, he said, resting his elbows on the counter. That is exactly why Valerie and I want to carry the heavy burdens for you. You should be focusing entirely on your emotional healing right now, not worrying about tedious legal obligations and frustrating bureaucratic paperwork. He reached down to the floor next to his stool and lifted a thick, neatly organized leather portfolio. He placed it gently on the island between us and opened the brass clasp. Inside was a massive stack of complex legal documents tagged with dozens of brightly colored sticky notes, indicating where signatures were required. I had my legal team draft these standard probate and estate transition papers late last night, Derek explained smoothly, tapping the top page with his expensive gold pen. It is just a routine transfer of administrative power. By signing these, you grant my firm the legal authority to handle the complex commercial properties, the tax liabilities, and the ongoing trust management. We will seamlessly take over the daily operational headaches. You will still retain ultimate ownership, of course, but I will possess the executive power to execute trades, manage the liquid assets, and finalize the transition. It is the absolute best way to protect your peace of mind. It was a brilliant lethal trap disguised as an act of familial mercy. If I signed those documents, I would be legally handing him the keys to my entire $50 million empire, completely surrendering my financial autonomy to a desperate predator. I looked down at the documents, letting my hands tremble slightly as I hovered my fingers over the pages. The psychological warfare had officially reached its absolute peak. Every single caring word Valerie spoke, every gentle reassurance Derek offered was laced with highly toxic, lethal greed. I just do not know if I have the mental energy to read through all of this legal jargon right now, I whispered, staring blankly at the complex paragraphs. My vision feels completely blurred. My head is pounding. Can we perhaps review this later in the week? Valerie stepped closer, wrapping her arm around my stooped shoulders. Her perfume was overpowering. Daddy, you do not need to read the tedious details, she cooed softly, placing the heavy gold pen directly into my trembling hand. Derek has already reviewed every single line perfectly. He is a professional wealth manager. He is your family. We are just trying to protect you from unnecessary stress. Just sign where the colored tabs indicate, and then you can go straight back upstairs to rest your weary mind. I gripped the pen loosely, bringing the tip dangerously close to the signature line. I could literally feel the electric anticipation radiating from their bodies. They were holding their breath, waiting for the final stroke of the pen that would secure their total victory. I let the nib hover a fraction of an inch above the crisp white paper, holding them in absolute agonizing suspense. Then I purposefully let my hand spasm. The gold pen slipped from my weak grip and clattered loudly onto the marble counter, rolling away. I am so incredibly sorry, I gasped, pressing the palms of my hands against my temples. I just cannot focus. The words are swimming on the page. I feel incredibly dizzy, Derek. My heart is racing too fast. I need to lie down immediately. I cannot sign anything today. Derek's jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might shatter. A flash of raw, unfiltered frustration broke through his sympathetic mask, but he quickly forced a tight, artificial smile back onto his face. Of course, Richard, he said, his voice straining slightly under the immense effort of maintaining his composure. We absolutely understand. There is no immediate rush. We will simply revisit the paperwork tomorrow morning. Your health is our primary concern. I stood up slowly, leaning heavily on the edge of the island for physical support, and began shuffling back toward the hallway. As I turned my back, I glanced casually at the reflective surface of the kitchen window. I watched Derek immediately snatch his digital tablet back up from the counter. His fingers flew across the glass screen with frantic, uncoordinated speed. I knew exactly what he was checking. He was logging into the secure banking portal, desperately checking the status of his $28 million offshore transfer. He was expecting the funds to have cleared the clearinghouse overnight. He was expecting to see a massive, life-changing balance sitting safely in the Cayman Islands. Instead, he was looking at a glaring, persistent notification that simply read, pending. I watched his broad shoulders tense violently. He frantically refreshed the browser, his thumb hitting the screen with increasing force. The status did not change. The federal hold was performing its invisible magic perfectly. The money was permanently frozen in a digital purgatory dangling just out of his reach. I walked away from the kitchen archway and slowly ascended the grand staircase toward my master bedroom. Every single step I took felt lighter than the last. The crushing weight of my grief was entirely subsumed by the cold and thrilling anticipation of their impending destruction. I reached the landing and paused in the heavy shadows to listen. I could hear Derek cursing softly under his breath. The sound was absolutely wonderful. He was pacing back and forth across the hard marble floor of the kitchen like a trapped animal. The massive offshore transfer he had banked his entire future upon was completely frozen. He had expected a clean, untraceable getaway. Instead, he was staring at a digital brick wall erected by federal authorities. Valerie asked him what was wrong, her voice laced with sudden irritation. He snapped back at her, offering a flimsy excuse about a server error. Their unified front was already beginning to fracture under the immense pressure of the blocked funds. I smiled in the quiet darkness of the hallway and entered my bedroom. The first night of the 48-hour waiting period had officially begun, and I was going to enjoy every single second of their psychological torture. The following morning arrived with a heavy blanket of gray clouds pressing down on the Boston skyline. I remained in my bed, deliberately tangling the expensive silk sheets and roughing up my hair to look like a man who had spent the entire night wrestling with inescapable sorrow. At precisely 9 in the morning, the heavy wooden door to my bedroom slowly creaked open. Valerie entered carrying a large silver tray. She walked softly across the thick carpet, wearing a soft pink cashmere sweater and an expression of profound, completely fabricated concern. She placed the tray gently onto my lap. It held a steaming pot of Earl Grey tea, 2 slices of dry toast, and right next to the porcelain cup, the thick stack of probate documents. "Daddy, you need to eat something," she whispered softly, brushing a stray lock of hair from my forehead. "You look completely drained. Derek and I are so incredibly worried about your declining health. We stayed up all night trying to figure out how to best support you during this incredibly painful transition." I stared blankly at the silver tray, letting a slight tremor take over my right hand as I reached for the porcelain teacup. I purposefully bumped the edge of the saucer, spilling a small pool of hot brown liquid onto the white linen napkin. I let out a frustrated, pathetic sigh. "My hands simply will not stop shaking today," I murmured, keeping my voice frail and exhausted. "I appreciate the breakfast, Valerie, but I have absolutely no appetite. I just want to close my eyes and pretend this entire nightmare is not happening." Valerie quickly wiped up the spilled tea with a cloth, maintaining her sickeningly sweet demeanor. "I know, Daddy," she cooed gently. "That is exactly why we need you to sign these papers this morning. Derek needs the legal authority to handle the estate taxes before the deadlines expire. If you do not sign them today, the government will penalize the family trust heavily. You do not want to lose the money you and Mom worked so hard to save, do you? Just sign the bottom line, and Derek will handle all the miserable details." Her psychological warfare was incredibly ruthless. She was weaponizing my supposed grief and using the threat of financial loss to force my compliance. I looked down at the documents, fighting the intense urge to laugh in her face. I am the man who built a $50 million empire, and she was trying to frighten me with imaginary tax deadlines. "I need to have Eleanor review these first," I said weakly, referencing my primary estate attorney. "I never sign anything without my legal counsel looking over the specific clauses." Valerie stiffened, her posture rigid with sudden tension. "Eleanor is incredibly busy, Daddy." Valerie insisted, her sweet tone gaining a sharp, desperate edge. "Derek is a licensed wealth manager. He already reviewed everything perfectly. Please just do this one simple thing so we can all finally relax." Before I could offer another excuse, the bedroom door opened again, and Derek walked into the room. The sight of him was absolutely glorious. The arrogant, polished con artist from yesterday had completely vanished. He looked like a man who was standing on the gallows. Derek was sweating profusely. His expensive dress shirt was wrinkled and dark, heavy bags hung beneath his bloodshot eyes. He was holding his mobile phone in a death grip, his knuckles completely white. He had clearly spent the entire night frantically trying to contact the offshore shell company, desperately seeking a reason why his stolen $28 million was not clearing the federal holding pattern. He looked at me with wild, aggressive impatience. "Richard, we really need those specific signatures right now," Derek demanded, abandoning any pretense of gentle sympathy. "The markets wait for no man, and I have incredibly sensitive investments that require immediate structural authorization to proceed." I looked up at him, letting my mouth hang open slightly in manufactured confusion. "Derek, you look terrible," I said softly. "Are you feeling well? Is there some kind of massive problem at your financial firm? You seem incredibly agitated for a man who just closed a major offshore deal." Derek swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat bobbing nervously. He shoved his mobile phone into his trouser pocket and forced a rigid, ghastly smile onto his pale face. "Everything is fine, Richard," he lied, his voice cracking noticeably on the final word. "I simply have a lot of complex administrative details to manage today, but I cannot move forward with the family portfolio until you grant me the legal authority." Valerie shoved the gold pen toward me again, her manicured fingers tapping impatiently against the silver tray. "Please, Daddy," she begged, her voice rising in pitch. "Just sign the papers so Derek can go to work." I took the heavy gold pen from her hand. I moved it toward the signature line at the bottom of the top page. Derek stepped forward, his breathing ragged and shallow, watching the tip of the pen like a starving man watching a meal. I slowly touched the nib to the crisp paper and drew the very first curve of the letter R. Then I stopped completely. I let out a sharp, sudden gasp and dropped the pen onto the floor. I grabbed the left side of my chest, squeezing the fabric of my pajama shirt tightly. "My chest hurts terribly," I gasped out, closing my eyes and leaning heavily back against the plush pillows. "I cannot breathe properly. The pain is incredibly sharp." Valerie let out a shriek of pure frustration, devoid of any genuine concern for my failing heart. Derek cursed loudly, kicking the solid oak doorframe in absolute despair. They rapidly retreated into the hallway to privately devise a new strategy. I lay perfectly still upon my bed. The agonizing wait was over. The destruction was finally arriving tomorrow. The dark, heavy hours of the night finally surrendered to a pale, freezing dawn. I remained in my bedroom just long enough to ensure my composure was absolutely perfect. I rose from the sheets dressed in a dark suit and walked silently down the grand staircase. The massive, sprawling house was completely quiet. Valerie and Derek were likely exhausted from their panicked pacing, catching a few hours of sleep. I bypassed the kitchen entirely and walked straight to my soundproof home office. I slowly pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner. The heavy steel bolts slid back with a soft hum. I stepped inside and locked the door securely behind me. At precisely 6 a.m, a shadow detached itself from the hedges outside. It was Mike. I pressed a button beneath my desk, unlocking the private side entrance. Mike stepped into the dim room, bringing the scent of the autumn morning. He did not say a word of greeting. He simply walked over to my large desk and placed an incredibly thick, heavy leather briefcase onto the polished mahogany surface. Mike unlatched the briefcase, the sharp metallic clicks echoing loudly in the quiet, isolated space. He reached inside and pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it across the desk toward me. "This is the primary financial profile you requested, Richard," Mike said, his gravelly voice completely devoid of any emotion. "I spent the entire night tracking the digital footprints of Derek. You were absolutely right to be highly suspicious today. Derek has been operating a highly sophisticated shadow network of shell companies for the better part of 5 years. He has currently accumulated massive amounts of toxic debt. He owes millions to private, unregulated lenders, men who do not take kindly to missed payments. That offshore transfer he attempted to initiate yesterday was not an investment strategy. It was a desperate final lifeline to save himself from total ruin. I opened the folder briefly, scanning the detailed spreadsheets and intercepted banking logs. The sheer volume of his toxic financial liabilities was breathtaking. But I already knew Derek was a thief and a fraud. This was simply the mechanical proof of his desperation. I closed the folder and looked up at Mike. "I appreciate the diligence, Mike," I said calmly. "But this is exactly what I expected to find. Derek is a cornered animal trying to steal my wife's legacy to cover his own pathetic failures." Mike did not nod or offer a supportive smile. Instead, he reached back into his leather briefcase. His rough, calloused hands retrieved a second, noticeably thicker folder. He held it for a brief moment, looking at me with a strange, unreadable expression. "You might want to pour yourself a glass of something strong before you open this one, Richard," Mike cautioned softly. "I told you I would tear their entire existence apart." I looked into the deepest, darkest corners of his personal life, exactly as you ordered. What I found goes far beyond simple corporate fraud and bad debts. He placed the second folder directly in front of me. It landed on the desk with a heavy, ominous thud. I did not reach for the bourbon decanter. I simply reached out and flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. The very first page was not a financial spreadsheet or a banking log. It was a high-resolution, full-color photograph. It showed a beautiful, sunlit suburban house with a perfectly manicured lawn. The architecture was distinctly Floridian, complete with tall palm trees and a bright blue swimming pool in the backyard. I turned the page. The next photograph hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It showed Derek. He was standing in the driveway of that exact same Florida house. He was not wearing his tailored, expensive Boston suits. He was wearing casual clothes, laughing brightly, and holding a young, beautiful blonde woman by the waist. She was looking up at him with absolute, undeniable adoration. But it was the third photograph that completely shattered the breath in my lungs. Derek was kneeling on the green grass holding a small boy who looked to be no more than 3 years old. The child shared Derek's exact facial features. It was an undeniable, living testament to a completely separate reality. Derek has a completely secret, entirely separate second family living in a quiet suburb just outside of Orlando. Mike explained, his voice perfectly steady as I stared at the glossy images. He purchased that property exactly 4 years ago under a heavily shielded corporate holding name. He visits them every single time he claims to be traveling on business for his wealth management firm. He has established an entire parallel universe down there, complete with a mistress and a toddler. I felt a sudden, sickening wave of pure disgust wash over me. I stared at the smiling face of the man who had just stood in my kitchen, pouring $5,000 champagne, with my daughter playing the role of the devoted, loving husband. I looked back up at Mike, my mind struggling to process the sheer logistical audacity of maintaining 2 entirely separate lives. How on earth does a man drowning in massive corporate debt manage to afford a luxury second home and silently support an entirely separate family? I asked, my voice dangerously low. Mike reached across the desk and flipped to the final section of the thick folder. He pointed a thick finger at a highlighted column of banking transfers. "He is not paying for it with his own money, Richard. He is paying for it with yours." I looked closely at the highlighted numbers. For the past 4 years, Derek had been systematically skimming massive amounts of money directly from the generous monthly allowance I deposited into Valerie's personal accounts. He had convinced Valerie to grant him total administrative access to her daily finances, claiming he could maximize her returns. Instead, he was quietly siphoning off tens of thousands of dollars every single month, routing the stolen cash through 3 different domestic banks, and using it to pay the mortgage, the groceries, and the living expenses of his secret Florida family. I sat back in my chair, completely stunned by the profound, twisted irony of the situation. Valerie, my cruel daughter, was actively being played for an absolute fool. The money she demanded from me was actually financing her husband's hidden mistress. For a brief second, a small spark of genuine paternal sympathy flared in my chest. She was a perpetrator of fraud, yes, but also a victim of a devastating deception. She gave this man her absolute trust, and he used her inheritance to build a life with someone else. But Mike was not finished with his grim report. He reached down and pulled out a small digital audio recorder. "You are suddenly feeling sorry for her, Richard," Mike stated flatly, his eyes locking onto mine. "Do not. I cloned Valerie's phone data last night. I recovered a deleted text exchange between her and Derek from 3 days ago before your wife had even passed. Listen to exactly what your daughter was planning to do to you." Mike pressed a button on the sleek metallic device. A synthesized voice began reading the recovered text messages aloud in my quiet office. The exchange was between Valerie and Derek, time-stamped exactly 72 hours before my beloved Beatrice took her final breath. Derek's message was frantic. He stated that the offshore holding company required secondary verification for the $28 million transfer. Because the funds were tied to a trust requiring Beatrice's physical authorization, digital forging was not enough. They needed her actual thumbprint to bypass biometric banking security. The automated voice read Valerie's chilling reply. "Do not worry about the thumbprint. She is heavily medicated. The hospice nurse leaves for her dinner break at 7. I will go into the room and take care of the paperwork myself. Just have the transfer ready to execute." I stared at the small digital recorder, feeling a suffocating numbness creeping up my throat. But Mike was not finished. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a slim, high-resolution tablet. He placed it carefully on the desk in front of me. "The text messages prove premeditated intent, Richard," Mike said, his voice dropping into a solemn register. "But I am a thorough investigator. I knew if Valerie went through with her plan, there had to be a physical record. I hacked into the secure cloud server managing your estate's internal security cameras. I focused entirely on the hidden lens installed in the ceiling corner of your wife's in-home hospice suite." Mike tapped the screen. A silent black and white video began to play. I felt my chest tighten, my lungs refusing to draw in air as I watched the grainy footage. The timestamp confirmed the date and time. It was exactly 3 days ago. The camera angle provided a comprehensive view of the dimly lit hospice room. I could see the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of the medical ventilator. I could see the complex array of intravenous drips and heart monitors. And there, resting in the center of the specialized hospital bed, was my beautiful, dying wife. Beatrice looked incredibly frail, completely consumed by the final stages of her illness. She was entirely comatose, heavily sedated, and peacefully unaware of the world around her. The heavy oak door slowly swung open. The silent video showed Valerie stepping into the quiet sanctuary. She was dressed in comfortable lounge clothes, looking completely unremarkable, like a devoted daughter coming in to sit vigil by her ailing mother's side. She approached the edge of the bed and paused. For a brief fleeting moment, I foolishly hoped she might lean down and kiss her mother's pale forehead. I hoped she might whisper a loving goodbye or shed a genuine tear for the remarkable woman who had given her life. Instead, Valerie quickly reached into the pocket of her sweater and produced a small rectangular ink pad and a thick stack of folded legal documents. I sat frozen in my leather chair, a silent scream building in the deepest depths of my soul as I watched the absolute atrocity unfold on the glowing screen. Valerie leaned over the metal guardrail of the medical bed. She did not look at her mother's face. She did not check the heart monitor. She callously reached down and grabbed Beatrice's limp, fragile hand. My wife's fingers were completely slack, devoid of any strength or resistance. Valerie ruthlessly flattened her mother's palm, exposing the thumb. She pressed the ink pad firmly against the pale skin, thoroughly coating the delicate ridges in dark black ink. My vision blurred with hot, stinging tears. I watched as my own daughter, the child I had protected from every single hardship the world had to offer, took her dying mother's hand and forcefully pressed the inked thumb onto the bottom of the forged wire transfer authorizations. She repeated this sickening mechanical process 3 separate times, ensuring the biometric signature was perfectly clear on every required page. When she was finally satisfied with her horrific handiwork, she unceremoniously dropped Beatrice's arm back onto the sterile white sheets. She did not bother to wipe the black ink from her mother's skin. She simply folded the fraudulent documents, shoved them back into her pocket, and walked out of the room without ever looking back. The heavy door swung shut, leaving my comatose wife completely alone in the silent, shadowed room. The video ended freezing on the haunting image of Beatrice's frail, ink-stained hand resting helplessly against the white hospital blankets. I could not speak. I could not move. The cold, calculating, incredibly powerful businessman who had spent the entire night meticulously plotting financial ruin was completely obliterated in that single agonizing moment. I was replaced entirely by a grieving, devastated, deeply wrathful husband. A raw, primal sound tore its way out of my throat, a ragged sob that echoed loudly against the soundproof walls of my private office. I buried my face in my trembling hands, weeping with a profound, consuming agony that I had never experienced in my entire life. Valerie had not just attempted to steal a fortune. She had deeply physically violated her own mother during the most sacred, vulnerable moments of her existence. She had weaponized a dying woman's helpless body to feed her own insatiable parasitic greed. It was a level of profound moral depravity that completely defied any logical comprehension. I had spent hours agonizing over my own failures as a father, taking accountability for spoiling her, for buying her affection, rather than teaching her character. I had convinced myself that her financial greed was partly my fault, a direct product of the luxurious environment I had so carefully constructed. But as I stared at the frozen image on the tablet, that misplaced paternal guilt completely evaporated. Spoiling a child might make them entitled. It might make them ungrateful, lazy, and arrogant. But no amount of excessive wealth could ever teach a daughter to physically assault her comatose mother for a bank transfer. That was not a byproduct of bad parenting. That was a manifestation of pure, unadulterated evil. It was an unforgivable sin, a complete absence of fundamental human empathy. I slowly lowered my hands, wiping the hot tears from my face. My grief was rapidly hardening into something entirely different. It was transforming into a cold, dense, absolute wrath. The sorrow that had been paralyzing my heart was entirely replaced by a terrifying, singular purpose. I looked across the mahogany desk at Mike. He was sitting perfectly still, respectfully granting me the space to process the absolute abyss of my daughter's betrayal. "You were right, Mike," I whispered, my voice sounding like grinding stones in the quiet room. "I am not feeling sorry for her anymore. There is absolutely no sympathy left in my heart." Mike nodded slowly, reaching forward to collect the tablet and the heavy manila folders. "You have all the evidence you need, Richard," he said. "The federal authorities will have a complete airtight case for major wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse. They will spend decades in a federal penitentiary." "Prison is absolutely essential," I stated, standing up from my chair with a renewed, terrifying energy. "But it is not enough. Before the federal agents put them in handcuffs, I want them to realize exactly what they have lost. I want them to feel the precise moment their entire arrogant world collapses into absolute dust. I want to look into their eyes when the illusion finally shatters." I gazed out at the morning light creeping across the manicured lawns. The 48-hour window was rapidly closing. The trap was perfectly primed. It was time to burn their kingdom entirely to the ground. Because today I will destroy them both. I stood by the window, letting the cold reality of my daughter's monstrous nature settle into my bones. The morning sun was rising, casting long, sharp shadows across the estate. I was ready to end this charade, to call Agent Harris and initiate the federal raid immediately. But Mike did not close his leather briefcase. He remained seated, his posture rigid and unyielding. "Richard," he said, his gravelly voice cutting through the heavy silence of the room, "I need you to step back from the window and sit down. I am not completely finished. There is one final piece." I turned around, feeling a sudden chill ripple down my spine. The horrific video of Beatrice had already shattered my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. I could not fathom what else could possibly remain in that thick manila folder. "What else could there be, Mike?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Valerie has already committed the ultimate unforgivable sin against her own mother. There is nothing lower. There is no deeper abyss." Mike pulled a stapled stack of printed emails from the very bottom of his briefcase and placed them on the desk. "This involves you." I walked slowly back to the mahogany desk, my eyes locked on the stark white pages. "These are encrypted digital communications," Mike explained, his tone shifting into the clinical, detached cadence of a tactical briefing. "I intercepted them directly from Valerie's private server just 2 hours ago. She has been corresponding extensively with a man named Dr. Eris Thorne. He is a private neurologist, operating a highly exclusive, discreet clinic in the city. He is also a man with a documented history of severe ethical violations, known in certain dark circles for providing favorable medical evaluations for wealthy clients." I picked up the top sheet of paper. The subject line of the email read, "Urgent consultation regarding my father." The body of the text was meticulously crafted, painting a tragic picture of a grieving widower suffering from a rapid, aggressive cognitive decline. "Why is she contacting a neurologist?" I asked, a sense of deep, primal dread beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. "Because you refused to sign the probate documents yesterday morning," Mike replied smoothly. "You played the confused, exhausted widower perfectly. You stalled their legal takeover, but you also made yourself an obstacle. They are completely desperate for liquidity, Richard. Derek's offshore transfer is permanently blocked, and his creditors are closing in fast. They cannot wait for you to slowly grieve or consult with your lawyers. They need absolute immediate control over your entire $50 million main trust by next Tuesday. And since you will not willingly hand over the executive power, they have constructed a secondary plan to take it from you by sheer force." I read the subsequent emails. The clinical terminology used by the doctor was chilling. Valerie was arranging a highly specialized involuntary psychiatric intervention immediately. "They are planning to drug your food," Mike stated, delivering the final crushing blow. "Dr. Thorne has illegally prescribed a powerful, fast-acting psychoactive medication. Valerie plans to dissolve the sedative into your tea or your evening meals over the next 48 hours. The specific dosage is designed to mimic the acute symptoms of a severe psychotic breakdown. It will induce extreme paranoia, intense confusion, and severe physical tremors. You will appear completely unhinged to any outside observer. Once the chemical agents take full effect, Valerie will call Dr. Thorne to the estate for an emergency medical evaluation. He will arrive playing the role of the deeply concerned family physician. He will formally diagnose you with an aggressive form of dementia, accelerated by the profound trauma of losing your wife. He will sign a mandatory psychiatric hold, declaring you an immediate danger to yourself. They will have you legally institutionalized, locked away in a secure private psychiatric ward against your will. Once you are declared mentally incompetent by a licensed medical professional, Valerie will immediately assume total legal guardianship over you and your entire estate. She will have absolute unrestricted access to your $50 million. I dropped the papers back onto the desk, my hands shaking with a new, terrifying realization. This was no longer just a financial crime. This was not simply a battle to protect Beatrice's legacy or secure my corporate assets from a greedy son-in-law. This had rapidly escalated into a desperate, immediate fight for my own physical survival and personal freedom. My own daughter was actively plotting to poison my food strip, away my legal rights, and lock me inside a padded room for the rest of my natural life, all to feed her insatiable parasitic greed. The profound shock morphed into an incredibly pure, highly concentrated fury. Every single memory I held of Valerie as a sweet, innocent child was instantly incinerated, replaced by the image of a cold, calculating predator sharpening her knives in my own kitchen. She had physically violated her comatose mother, and now she was meticulously planning to erase her father from society. The illusion of family was completely dead. There was no daughter left to mourn. There was only a highly dangerous, incredibly toxic enemy sleeping beneath my roof. And I was standing directly in the center of her crosshairs. The timeline had drastically shifted. I could no longer play the long, agonizing waiting game. If I consumed a single meal prepared by her hands, my entire mind would be hijacked by synthetic chemicals, and the federal authorities would find a babbling, incoherent old man instead of a reliable witness. "We do not have 48 hours anymore, Mike," I said, my voice echoing with an absolute lethal authority. "We do not even have 12 hours. I need to strike them immediately. I need to sever the head of the snake before they have the opportunity to strike first." Mike nodded in solemn agreement, his hand resting on the heavy leather briefcase. "I have already secured all the digital copies of the medical correspondence. The evidence of premeditated assault and conspiracy is completely undeniable. You have everything you need to bury them beneath a mountain of federal indictments." "What are your orders, Richard?" I reached for the encrypted mobile phone resting on the mahogany desk. "I am calling Agent Harris right now," I replied, my eyes hardening into chips of solid ice. "The covert intelligence gathering phase is officially over. The waiting game is completely finished today." I slowly dialed the direct unlisted emergency line to the elite Federal Financial Crimes Unit. I listened to the quiet, rhythmic ringing, intensely feeling the heavy, inescapable weight of the moment settling firmly onto my tired shoulders. I was about to deliberately invite an overwhelming, completely destructive force directly into my home. I was about to unleash a massive public storm that would completely shatter the proud Montgomery family name across every single newspaper in Boston forever. But as the federal agent finally answered the secure call, I felt absolutely no hesitation. Valerie desperately wanted to declare me incompetent and steal my kingdom. Instead, she was going to permanently face the absolute unbreakable wrath of the king. The secure line clicked dead, leaving me in the heavy, absolute silence of my private office. The federal gears were now in motion, an unstoppable avalanche of justice barreling toward my heavily fortified estate. Agent Harris had confirmed the tactical strike teams were assembling, operating under the highest level of absolute secrecy. I placed the encrypted mobile phone back onto the smooth mahogany surface, took a deep, steadying breath, and mentally prepared myself for the final, horrifying performance. The digital clock on my desk glowed with red numbers, indicating that the evening had arrived. It was time for the final supper. I unlocked the heavy oak door and walked slowly down the long, shadowed corridor toward the formal dining room. The scent of roasted garlic and expensive culinary herbs wafted through the high ceilings, creating a deceptive atmosphere of domestic warmth. When I crossed the threshold into the dining room, the suffocating claustrophobia of the scene instantly settled heavily against my chest. The massive custom-built dining table, which seated 24 people and had been carved from a single slab of imported Italian walnut, was set for only 3. I walked slowly toward my usual seat at the absolute head of the table. As I sat down, I looked at the exquisite setting before me. I was sitting in the expensive chair I had purchased, resting my hands on the table I had bought at preparing to eat off the fine bone china plates I had paid for, and I was entirely surrounded by the very predators I had fed for years. Valerie was bustling around the adjacent kitchen, humming a cheerful, upbeat melody that sharply contrasted with the incredibly somber atmosphere she had projected for the past 48 hours. Derek was standing near the antique crystal chandelier, pouring a dark, heavy red wine into 3 tall glasses. He moved with a stiff, anxious energy, his eyes darting constantly toward the grand entryway. "Dinner is served," Daddy Valerie announced cheerfully, emerging from the kitchen, carrying a large silver platter. She had prepared my favorite meal, a slow-roasted prime rib with glazed root vegetables. The supreme, chilling irony of the gesture was not lost on me. She placed a generously portioned plate directly in front of me, her smile stretched so tightly across her face that it looked incredibly painful. "We decided we needed to host a special moving on dinner," she explained, taking her seat to my immediate right. We have spent the last 2 days drowning in our absolute sorrow, and Mom would not want us to stop living our lives. She would want us to find a beautiful path forward together as a family. I looked down at the steaming cut of meat and the rich, dark gravy pooling on the pristine white china. Somewhere within that perfectly arranged plate of food was a massive, highly dangerous dose of unauthorized psychoactive medication. Dr. Thorne's prescription was waiting right there to completely hijack my neurological system, to induce the violent tremors and paranoid delusions that would legally justify my permanent commitment to a psychiatric asylum. The sheer cold-blooded cruelty of her domestic hospitality was breathtaking. I picked up my heavy silver fork and knife, pushing the meat around the plate with a slow, deliberate lethargy, creating the distinct illusion that I was preparing to take a bite without actually lifting a single morsel to my lips. "It smells absolutely wonderful, Valerie," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly low and frail. "But my stomach is tied in absolute knots. I do not think I can manage a single bite tonight." Derek stepped forward immediately, abandoning his wineglass on the polished wooden sideboard. He moved with a sudden, predatory swiftness, positioning himself directly behind my chair. He crossed his thick arms over his chest, his large frame entirely blocking my only direct path to the hallway exit. The physical intimidation was not subtle. It was a clear, calculated message that I was no longer the master of this room. I was their captive audience. "You really need to keep your physical strength up, Richard," Derek said, his voice dropping into a low, commanding register that carried a very thin, incredibly dangerous edge of absolute menace. "You cannot let your physical health deteriorate. We have a lot of complex, highly important family business to handle this evening, and we need your mind to be perfectly sharp." Valerie reached beneath the table and produced a thick, leather-bound portfolio. It was not the same stack of documents they had attempted to force upon me the previous morning. This stack was significantly thicker, carrying the heavy weight of absolute finality. She placed the portfolio squarely in the center of my bone china plate, right on top of the poisoned prime rib, and flipped the heavy cover open. "We have been incredibly patient, Daddy," Valerie cooed, her voice dripping with that same toxic honeyed sweetness she had utilized in the kitchen. "But the administrative transition simply cannot wait another single day. Derek has restructured the standard probate papers to make the executive transition completely seamless for you." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy, incredibly expensive Mont Blanc fountain pen. She slid it across the smooth walnut table. The gold trim caught the light of the crystal chandelier as it rolled to a stop right next to my right hand. But there was another document resting directly beneath the primary estate transfer forms. It was printed on the distinct formal letterhead of a private medical clinic. I recognized the prominent logo of Dr. Aris Thorne instantly. "What is this specific document, Valerie?" I asked, letting my fingers gently trace the edge of the medical letterhead, maintaining the perfect illusion of a confused, deeply grieving old man trying to comprehend complex paperwork. Valerie did not blink. Her eyes were completely void of any human warmth. "Oh, that is just a standard routine medical evaluation consent form," she explained smoothly, without a single ounce of hesitation. "Since you have been struggling so terribly with your breathing and your heart rate since the funeral, Derek and I thought it would be best to have a private concierge doctor come to the estate to check on your vitals. It is just a minor precaution, Daddy. We simply want to ensure you are entirely healthy. Just sign, Daddy. We will take care of absolutely everything else." The sheer magnitude of her deception was staggering. She was sweetly asking me to sign away my $50 million empire and legally consent to my own psychiatric imprisonment in the exact same breath. Derek shifted his weight behind my chair, the leather creaking softly under the pressure. I could feel his hostile, aggressive energy radiating down toward my shoulders. He was fully prepared to physically intimidate me into signing those papers if my hesitation lasted a moment longer. I looked at the heavy gold pen resting on the table. I thought about the decades I had spent building my business, the countless hours I had sacrificed to ensure this family had every single luxury the world could possibly offer. I thought about my beautiful Beatrice lying comatose in her bed, while her own daughter used her limp thumb to steal a fortune. And I thought about the federal strike teams currently speeding down the dark rain-slicked roads toward my front gates. I reached out and slowly picked up the Mont Blanc pen. The cold metal felt incredibly heavy in my trembling hand. I removed the gold cap, the soft click echoing loudly in the tense, absolutely suffocating silence of the dining room. Valerie leaned forward, her eyes locked onto the tip of the pen with a rabid, desperate hunger. Derek took half a step closer, his shadow falling completely over my plate. The psychological warfare had reached its absolute zenith. They firmly believed they had won. They firmly believed I was completely broken. They firmly believed they were going to walk away with my entire kingdom tonight. I let the nib hover precisely 1 inch above the signature line, holding my breath, waiting for the inevitable sound that would shatter their world. The agonizing seconds stretched into an absolute eternity. The silence in the room was so incredibly dense, it felt like a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. I kept my hand hovering over the fraudulent papers, staring at the blank line where my name was supposed to seal my ultimate doom. I was not going to sign a single letter. I was simply holding them in the very palm of my hand, keeping them completely focused on the illusion of victory, absolutely blind to the devastating storm about to break. I gripped the pen tighter. "Come on, Harris," I whispered deep within the confines of my own mind. "Kick the door down. I am absolutely ready." The heavy gold Mont Blanc pen hovered a fraction of an inch above the crisp white paper. I could hear the shallow intakes of breath from Valerie and Derek. They were waiting for the ink to flow for the surrender of my life and legacy. Instead, with a deliberate motion, I lifted the pen. I calmly placed the gold cap back over the nib. The metallic click echoed through the massive dining room like a gunshot. The suffocating tension shattered instantly. Derek shifted his weight behind my chair, letting out a sharp breath of frustration. Valerie leaned forward, her mask of sweet concern slipping to reveal raw, desperate panic. "Daddy, what are you doing?" Valerie asked, her voice trembling. "You need to sign right now. Your health is failing." "My health is perfectly fine, Valerie," I replied. My voice was no longer the frail whisper of a broken widower. It resonated deeply, projecting the absolute authority of a man who commanded an empire. I sat up straight, discarding the defeated posture I had maintained for 2 days. I turned to look at Derek, who stared down at me in genuine confusion. "And I will not be signing a single page of this absolute garbage." I reached inside my tailored suit jacket. I withdrew the worn, faded blue bank passbook. The very same passbook Valerie had snatched from my hands and dismissed as irrelevant trash on the day her mother passed. I tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table. It landed squarely on top of Dr. Thorne's fraudulent psychiatric evaluation forms. "Do you remember this blue book, Valerie?" I asked, my eyes locking onto hers. "You threw it away. You said it was completely worthless. But this book represents the foundation of everything this family built. It represents honest, grueling work. It represents a time before my daughter transformed into a parasitic vulture willing to poison her own father for a payout." Valerie gasped, physically recoiling in her chair, as if I had struck her. Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She glanced frantically at Derek, silently begging him to fix the collapse of their master plan. "Richard, you are clearly having a severe cognitive episode," Derek stated, his voice dropping into a harsh, threatening growl as he stepped around the side of my chair. "You are completely delusional. We need to call the doctor immediately. Sit down and shut your mouth, Derek." I commanded, my tone slicing through his pathetic intimidation tactic with absolute precision. I reached down to the floor and lifted Mike's thick leather briefcase onto my lap. I popped the brass latches and pulled out the first manila folder. I slammed it down onto the table. "I am not delusional." I continued, staring directly at my arrogant son-in-law. "I am simply well informed. I know everything about your pathetic, desperate existence, Derek. I know about the mountains of toxic debt you are hiding. I know about the violent loan sharks who are currently hunting you down for missed payments. And I know about the $28 million offshore transfer to the Cayman Islands that is permanently frozen by federal authorities. Derek's face drained of all color. The smug, confident wealth manager instantly vanished, replaced by a terrified cornered animal. He stumbled backward, his legs hitting the edge of the sideboard. I opened the folder and grabbed the stack of glossy high-resolution photographs. I scattered them across the fine bone china plates. But worst of all, Derek, I said, my voice dripping with pure disgust. I know about your beautiful sunlit house in Orlando. I know about your blonde mistress, and I know about your 3-year-old son. Valerie let out a piercing, shattered scream. She snatched up the photographs, her eyes frantically darting over the images of Derek holding another woman, swinging a blonde child in a sunny Florida backyard. Her hands shook violently. You have been actively playing my daughter for an absolute fool, I stated, delivering the brutal facts with mechanical efficiency. You have been systematically skimming tens of thousands of dollars from her monthly allowance to secretly finance your entirely separate second family. You used my money to build a parallel universe, and you planned to use the stolen offshore funds to flee the country and leave Valerie completely ruined. Derek. What is this? Valerie shrieked, tears of horrified shock streaming down her face. She threw the photographs at his chest. Tell me this is a lie. Tell me right now. Derek could not speak. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, desperately searching for an exit. Do not expect the truth from a coward, Valerie, I said, my voice echoing loudly in the chaotic room. But do not sit there playing the role of the innocent, heartbroken victim. You lost the right to claim the moral high ground the moment you walked into your dying mother's hospice room. Valerie froze completely. Her tears stopped flowing. The absolute terror in her eyes was profound. I reached back into the briefcase and pulled out the final stack of documents. I threw the stark, undeniable evidence onto the table. It was the sequence of still frames printed directly from the hidden security camera footage. The images clearly showed Valerie standing over Beatrice's comatose body. They showed her grabbing her mother's frail, lifeless hand and forcefully pressing her thumb onto the dark ink pad. I watched the video, Valerie. I whispered the raw, searing pain of a grieving husband, bleeding through my stoic facade. I watched you physically violate the woman who gave you life. I watched you use her helpless, dying body to stamp a fraudulent wire transfer so you could steal her legacy. You did not even have the decency to wipe the black ink from her fingers before you left her alone to die. Daddy, no, please, I can't explain, Valerie sobbed, shrinking back into her chair, desperately trying to shield herself from the horrifying visual evidence of her own monstrous depravity. There is absolutely no explanation for true evil, I roared, slamming my fists down onto the solid walnut table. The crystal glasses shook violently. You were planning to poison my food tonight. You were planning to use Dr. Thorne to declare me legally insane. You were going to lock me in a psychiatric ward for the rest of my natural life to steal the rest of my fortune. You are a vile, disgusting predator, Valerie. You are no longer a daughter of mine. The sheer weight of the absolute truth crushed the oxygen out of the dining room. Valerie buried her face in her hands, weeping hysterically, utterly destroyed by the undeniable exposure of her unforgivable sins. But Derek was not weeping. The realization of his absolute destruction fundamentally altered his brain chemistry. He looked at the scattered photographs. He realized the $28 million was gone forever. He realized the federal authorities knew everything. The violent loan sharks were coming, and he had nothing left to offer them. A guttural roar tore through his throat. He completely lost his mind and violently lunged across the mahogany table. Derek's heavy hands were mere inches from my throat. His face contorted into a mask of pure, desperate violence. The expensive crystal wine glasses shattered loudly as his knees slammed into the edge of the mahogany table, sending dark red wine spilling rapidly across the fraudulent medical documents. Time seemed to slow to an absolute crawl. I did not flinch at all. I did not move a single muscle to defend myself. I simply sat perfectly still in my chair, staring directly into the wide eyes of a man who suddenly realized his entire existence was completely over. Before Derek could even lay a single filthy finger on the lapel of my tailored suit jacket, a deafening, thunderous crash violently shook the massive foundation of the grand estate. The massive, heavily reinforced oak front doors were completely blown clean off their heavy iron hinges. The terrifying sound of splintering wood and shattering glass echoed fiercely down the long hallway, followed immediately by the heavy rhythmic thud of tactical boots hitting the polished hardwood floors. Federal agents dressed entirely in full tactical gear and dark body armor flooded into the formal dining room, like a massive, unstoppable tide of absolute justice. The sheer speed and overwhelming physical force of the calculated breach were absolutely terrifying to witness. The dark, claustrophobic atmosphere Valerie and Derek had so carefully constructed around me was instantly obliterated by incredibly blinding tactical flashlights and the harsh, commanding shouts of federal law enforcement. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Get your hands high in the air. Get down on the ground. Right dead now. Agent Harris, a tall, incredibly imposing man with sharp eyes like polished steel, led the primary strike team straight into the center of the dining room. Derek froze mid-lunge, completely suspended awkwardly over the ruined dinner table. The fierce, animalistic rage burning in his eyes was instantly extinguished, replaced rapidly by the hollow, wide-eyed stare of absolute paralyzing terror. Do not move a single muscle. Derek Agent Harris commanded, his strong voice booming with undeniable authority across the space. A thick, heavy tactical rifle was aimed squarely at the very center of Derek's chest. Derek slowly raised his violently trembling hands into the air, the gold fountain pen clattering uselessly against the fine bone china plates. Two heavily armored federal agents surged rapidly forward without a single moment of hesitation. They aggressively grabbed Derek by the lapels of his incredibly expensive suit jacket, violently ripping him aggressively away from the edge of the dining table. They slammed his large frame incredibly hard against the elegant hand-painted wallpaper of the formal dining room wall. The intense physical impact knocked the breath entirely out of his lungs in a sharp gasp. A harsh, metallic click loudly echoed through the room as heavy steel handcuffs were aggressively snapped tightly around his wrists. Derek immediately sagged helplessly against the wall, a pathetic, entirely broken shell of the deeply arrogant wealth manager who had stood so proudly in my kitchen just 2 short days prior. The federal agents instantly began reading him his official rights, clearly listing the incredibly severe federal charges of major wire fraud, grand larceny, extortion, and criminal conspiracy. Valerie had completely collapsed heavily back into her upholstered dining chair when the front doors were first breached. She was rapidly hyperventilating, her manicured hands clamped tightly over her ears, as if she could somehow physically block out the utterly devastating reality rapidly unfolding all around her. The blinding tactical flashlights swept ruthlessly across her pale, heavily tear-stained face. Agent Harris approached the table, his sharp eyes quickly and efficiently assessing the chaotic scene before him. He looked intently at the shattered crystal fragments, the spilled red wine, the glossy printed photographs of Derek's totally secret Florida family, and the entirely undeniable security footage stills explicitly showing Valerie cruelly assaulting her comatose mother. Finally, his cold gaze landed heavily on the thick leather medical portfolio and the deeply fraudulent estate transfer documents scattered across my plate. "Are you completely unharmed?" Richard Agent Harris asked, his tone smoothly shifting to a highly respectful, strictly professional register. "I am perfectly fine, Agent Harris," I replied very smoothly, calmly, adjusting the crisp cuffs of my dark suit jacket. "I have securely contained all the primary physical evidence right here on the mahogany table. The raw digital copies have already been flawlessly transmitted directly to your highly secure federal servers by my private investigator. You possess absolutely everything you need to safely proceed with the immediate arrests." Valerie suddenly snapped violently out of her completely paralyzed state of shock. She watched the armed federal agents roughly hauling Derek firmly toward the ruined front entrance of the grand estate. She saw another female federal agent stepping firmly toward her, slowly pulling a second pair of cold steel handcuffs from a heavy tactical utility belt. The absolute severity of the rapidly deteriorating situation finally pierced right through her incredibly deep layers of deeply toxic, selfish entitlement. "Daddy, please," Valerie screamed, an incredibly shrill, completely desperate sound that fiercely tore straight through the heavily crowded dining room. She frantically threw herself violently out of her dining chair, dropping incredibly heavily onto her bruised knees right beside me. She fiercely grabbed the thick fabric of my suit trousers, her warm tears soaking rapidly into the dark, expensive wool. "Daddy, you simply cannot let them do this. You have to quickly stop them. Tell them this is just a huge mistake." She looked desperately up at me, her face a highly messy, entirely pathetic mask of pure, unadulterated terror. "Tell them it is just a highly simple family misunderstanding. Daddy, I am your very own daughter. You truly love me. You solemnly promised Mom you would absolutely always take excellent care of me. Do not ever let them actively take me completely away in steel handcuffs. Please, Daddy, I will honestly do absolutely anything you possibly want." I looked silently down at the weeping, intensely trembling woman kneeling pathetically on the polished hardwood floor. I felt absolutely nothing inside. The incredibly deep, loving, paternal bond that had vividly defined my entire adult life was completely severed, replaced entirely by a completely cold, highly impenetrable void. I clearly saw the very same manicured hands that were currently begging so desperately for fatherly mercy, ruthlessly pressing black ink deeply onto Beatrice's incredibly fragile, actively dying thumb. I very slowly reached down and extremely firmly detached her desperately gripping fingers directly from my expensive clothing. I calmly stood up completely from the ornate head of the dining table, looking silently down directly at her with absolute unforgiving ice in my eyes. "You told me Mom's things were just trash, Valerie," I quietly said, my steady voice echoing with a remarkably cold, utterly devastating finality. "I am just taking the trash out." Valerie instantly let out a deeply broken, incredibly agonizing wail as the female agent extremely firmly grabbed her tightly by the arms, hauling her quite roughly directly to her feet. The heavy steel handcuffs loudly clicked extremely securely, completely around Valerie's slender wrists. She sobbed completely uncontrollably as they marched her out. The nightmare ended finally. 6 months have passed since that dark, violent evening in my dining room. The steady passage of time has a profound way of washing away the thick layers of ash left behind by a massive, devastating fire. Derek is currently residing in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The elite financial crimes unit completely dismantled his intricate shadow network, leaving absolutely no stone unturned. The presiding judge handed down a severe 15-year sentence without any possibility of early parole. He traded his tailored Boston suits for a standard orange uniform, spending his empty days locked behind heavily reinforced steel doors, entirely stripped of his arrogant pride and his stolen wealth. The violent loan sharks he feared so desperately were systematically rounded up during the subsequent investigations, but that offers him absolutely no comfort inside his cold, isolated cell. Valerie, my only daughter, managed to narrowly avoid a federal prison sentence. When she finally realized the absolute totality of the criminal case assembled against her, her fundamental cowardice took complete control. She immediately turned state's evidence, testifying completely and thoroughly against her husband, in exchange for full legal immunity regarding the medical fraud and the attempted embezzlement. However, her physical freedom came with an incredibly heavy price. She is completely destitute. The federal government quickly seized every single asset purchased with Derek's illicit funds. I officially disowned her legally, severing all financial and familial ties without a single ounce of hesitation. My high-priced lawyers ensured she would never receive a single penny from my estate or her mother's trust. She now works a grueling minimum-wage retail job on the outskirts of the city, taking the public bus to a very small, cramped apartment. She has sent me a dozen handwritten letters begging desperately for forgiveness, pleading for another chance to be a family. I returned every single envelope completely unopened. The bridge between us is permanently burned, completely reduced to worthless ashes by her own horrific actions. Today, the autumn wind is remarkably crisp and completely refreshing. I am standing quietly on a bustling corner in the historic district of downtown Boston, looking softly at a beautiful brick building. This was Beatrice's old bookshop, the very place she loved more than anything else in the entire world. Using the recovered $28 million from the blocked offshore accounts, I completely purchased the entire property and the surrounding buildings. I transformed the humble shop into the Beatrice Vance Literary Foundation, a massive, brilliantly funded non-profit organization dedicated exclusively to securing and preserving her immense legacy. It provides comprehensive literacy programs, fully funded scholarships, and beautiful community libraries for underprivileged children across the entire state. I watch a group of young students walk joyfully through the polished oak doors, their bright faces illuminated by the warm golden light spilling from the grand windows. Beatrice's name is carved beautifully into the solid granite above the entrance, shining brightly for the entire city to see. She is no longer defined by the tragic, fragile state of her final days. She is defined entirely by her vast knowledge, her endless generosity, and her enduring love. A profound, entirely complete sense of absolute peace washes warmly over my tired soul, permanently silencing the lingering painful echoes of the past 6 months. I look one last time at the magnificent stone letters, knowing that justice has been perfectly served. The predators who sought to destroy this family have been completely eradicated from my world. The fortune they desperately tried to steal is now building a beautiful future for thousands of innocent children. I smile gently, adjusting the lapel of my tailored coat. I turn smoothly away from the beautiful foundation, step gracefully into the quiet, luxurious interior of my waiting Bentley, and calmly instruct the driver to take me home, finally at peace. The driver nods respectfully, pulling smoothly into the busy street. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and integrity truly make you family. In life, we often close our eyes to the toxic behavior of those we love, hoping our generosity will fix their broken character. But pouring money into an empty soul only breeds entitlement, never gratitude. True strength is not just about providing for your family. It is having the absolute courage to cut the rot out of your life when that family turns into parasites. Never let your love make you blind, and never let anyone, even your own flesh and blood, mistake your kindness for weakness. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another deep dive into real-life drama. Have you ever had to cut a toxic family member out of your life? Share your experience in the comments down below today.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my leads me home. He taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my Father's daughter, and every step I take, and every time I choose to stand, when it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low, but the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my Father's daughter, and I always will remain. Through every triumph, every loss, through every joy and every pain, the world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly.